Hello, I'm Lois Parkinson Zamora, and I'm a professor in the English department, lately Dean of the College of Humanities, Fine Arts, and Communication. And I want to talk to you today about some part of my own particular area, which is comparative studies of U.S. and Latin American fiction. So I am a literary critic, and what I do is talk about novels primarily, and primarily contemporary U.S. and Latin American novels. But today I'm not going to do that since we don't have a novel open in front of us. Ordinarily in my classes of literature, of course, we've read a book and we come together to discuss it. What I want today to do with you is talk about some ideas that impel the various colonial projects in the New World. But before I do that, I want to tell you about a couple of programs that I'm interested in your knowing about and that may interest you either this summer or some summer in the future. The first is my program developed with Professor Manuel Gutierrez in the Spanish department in Mexico, in the city of Querétaro, a beautiful colonial capital north of Mexico City. As you see on your screen, it's from June 3rd to July 3rd this summer, 1997. If by chance you're watching this in the fall, count on this program again being offered in 1998. It's upper division and graduate courses given in both English and Spanish. And the idea of this program is that it's not only Spanish majors and Spanish graduate students and history students studying Mexico who will benefit from an experience in Mexico. It's all of us. We're all interested, presumably, in Mexico. And so courses in literature, culture, architecture, art in Querétaro for a month. This summer, 97, the cost is going to be $1,700, which includes all expenses. It includes the courses, and there are fellowships available. So I encourage you, if you're an advanced undergraduate or a graduate student that is upper division or graduate, please call. I'll put on the screen, if you can find it here, I guess that's going to be a little difficult. Hang on. There, it's Manuel Gutierrez, or my email as well, lzamora@UH.edu. So please contact us if you think you have any interest at all in this program, a month in Mexico. The other announcement I have is a marvelous lecture on the 11th of March, Tuesday night. A Mexican architect who is an expert in restoration of colonial monuments named Leonardo Meraz will be lecturing at the Architecture School. It's at 6 o'clock, the 11th of March, which is a Tuesday, and I very much encourage you to attend. It should be very interesting. Okay, well, with those announcements, let me say one more kind of prefatory remark, and that is the nature of my own discipline. I said I'm a comparatist, and what I compare is contemporary U.S. and Latin American fiction. But I think all of you are becoming comparatists in this course as we look at American cultures as a hemispheric matter. Suddenly we're asking you, and I think the lecturers have gone in the direction of being conversant with both Hispanic and Anglo-American cultures. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the difference? Why are these, as Octavio Paz says in our essay, two different forms of Western civilization? What I'm going to look at today is primarily ideas. What are the ideas that drive the colonization drive Spain to colonize New Spain, drive England to colonize New England, and what are the differences? Why have we become different? Why were we different to begin with? And what I'm going to suppose is that ideas drive events. It is what Octavio Paz supposes in the essay that I've asked you to read for today, and I will put that essay here and take a drink of water. This essay was in your course packet, and I do ask you to read it with care. In the meantime, I'm going to have to get a cough drop. And somebody may have to fill in for me. You'll excuse me if I choke and croak while I talk to you. Sorry about that. what I'd like to do is walk through this essay and look at the ways in which Octavio Paz supposes differences between cultures. If you look at page 1, I've done some underlining for you. Here, this statement that he starts with, we're two different versions of Western civilization. What does he mean by that? If you go to the next page. On 358, that's 359, he again is tracing difference. I think this is important because we have to see where those differences come from. He begins, does he not, in this essay by looking at the different the different nature of the indigenous groups that were found by the English and by the Spanish when they arrived in the New World. Actually, this part is also interesting. Let's look at this. This is before he gets to the part that's the nomadic groups. And what he says is, before we can talk about differences in civilization, we have to talk about what civilization is as such. And so he gives us a nice long Passian definition of civilization. He says down at the bottom of 358, if you're there, it's on the screen, the reality to which we give the name of civilization does not allow of easy definition. It is each society's vision of the world, and also its feeling about time. There are nations that are hurrying toward the future and others whose eyes are fixed on the past. You see, he's setting up a difference that he will describe between the US and Mexico, an orientation toward the future or toward the past. Civilization is a society's style, its way of living and dying. It embraces the erotic and the culinary arts, dancing and burial, courtesy and curses, work and leisure, ritual and festivals, punishments and rewards, dealings with the dead and with the ghosts who people are dreams, attitudes toward women and children, old people and strangers, enemies and allies, eternity and the present, the here and now, and the beyond. A civilization is not only a system of values, but a world of forms and codes of behavior. Rules. It is a society's visible side, institutions, monuments, works, things, but it is especially its submerged, invisible side, beliefs, desires, fears, repressions, and dreams. I read that passage at some length because it strikes me that here we see the terrible difficulty of deciding about different forms of Western civilization, Mexico and the US. The complexity is obviously there, and now let's sort that out. How do we decide what are our different forms of civilization? Well, Octavio Paz has outlined a very nice comparative argument, and I do think that looking at that quickly together in this form is a way to proceed. So let's do it. His first, excuse me, I'm going to continue to cough, just ignore me. His first point is the different kinds of peoples that the Spanish and the English encountered. The great settled cities in Mesoamerica, as opposed to nomadic groups, hunters and gatherers in the Northeast. Now keep in mind the very different time frame here too. Remember that the conquest or the defeat of Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, was 1521. Plymouth, the landing of the Mayflower at Plymouth is 1620. So we're already talking about a century of difference, but that's not Paz's concern at this point. His concern is to describe the different kinds of indigenous civilizations that Europe encountered. And so if you look at that paragraph at the top of 360 on down through the part that I've underlined here, he moves quickly, Paz does, from that distinction between the kinds of civilizations encountered in the New World to those civilizations encountering them, the English and the Spanish. And look at what he does here. At this line he says, and so the new opposition between English and Spaniards was grafted onto the old opposition between nomadic and settled people. Now, what is this new opposition? Keep on going down this paragraph and we'll see it. All of them can be summed up, these differences that he's talking about, in one fundamental difference, in which perhaps the dissimilar evolution of Mexico and the United States originated. In England, the Reformation triumphed, whereas Spain was the champion of the Counter-Reformation. This is going to be Paz's central concern now for, as you know if you've read the essay, for about 2 or 3 pages. And for him, this difference between Reformed or Reformation England and Counter-Reformation Spain is essential. What is the difference? He comes to a moment on about 3 pages hence, and we'll look at it specifically, where he says, it can all be summed up in the difference between one being an inclusive culture and the other an exclusive culture. Which is exclusive and which is inclusive? The Puritan culture that landed in Plymouth in 1620 on Plymouth Rock is exclusive, according to Paz. What does that mean? It's a culture, a form of civilization that's not interested in assimilating the peoples it finds in the New World. It's not interested in converting those people to its own group belief. What happens in Puritan culture, you'll remember your American history, when there's a difference of opinion among people within the community, simply the people who differ leave and form another group. Rhode Island, you remember the history of Rhode Island. So here, this is an exclusive society. It's a pluralist society. It's a society that says, fine, you can believe what you want. I don't have to include you in my worldview. Rather, go and form your own colony and ultimately form your own culture. The Puritans are a very extreme version of this Reformation ideology. As you know, they were not even coming from England. They were coming from Holland, where they had spent 9 years because they felt that England wasn't reformed enough. So the Puritans, their name implies, were interested in purity. They were interested in their own group without any real interest in difference. So if you've read Puritan literature, you know the references to the indigenous peoples in Massachusetts are kind of on the periphery. There's no real interest in their culture or their civilization, certainly no interest in including them in their own worldview. They were just out there and called terrible names, howling barbarians and so forth. Okay, so that's an exclusive point of view. It's one that leads to a democracy, a pluralistic democracy such as our own, where people have individual rights. Their rights are protected by law, and the community as such, while important, is probably going to be less important than the individual in terms of what is prioritized both in law and in practice. Now, take the inclusive culture, the centrist culture that Paz talks about, that Spain brought to Mesoamerica, to the great cities, the settled groups, the Aztecs, the Toltecs, and so forth. This is another kind of imperial project, whereas the Puritans had no interest in converting the peoples they found, no interest whatsoever in conversion. There were exceptions, but basically it was not an interest of the Puritans to convert. The Spanish conquest was justified by conversion. The Catholic conquest insisted that it's one of its most important jobs, in fact, the one that drove the conquest in the first place, is to include all peoples of the world. The Catholic, as you know, the Catholic Church is a centrist system. It is the true church, and everything must be included. Well, how do you do that when you arrive at Tenochtitlan in 1521? If you're Hernán Cortés, how do you say, we will convert these people? Well, first you conquer them. And it's a very, very convenient combination, conquest and conversion. As I said, one justifies the other. But what you ultimately do, if you're the Spaniards in Mexico, is you begin to not only preach the gospel, as it were, but you begin to assimilate indigenous forms into the centrist structure, into your own set of beliefs and practices. You try to make things fit. You have to, because it's a single system. Not like the Puritans, where there's no need to make things fit, no need to integrate difference into a single system. So you can start to see where I'm headed, and if you know Mexico at all, you can see it instantly. The kinds of mestizaje, the kinds of mixing of cultures that we see the moment we are in Mexico are due to this idea, to this ideology, this centrist inclusive ideology, which is the counter-Reformation attitude, Catholic attitude toward its domain. So we can say that both imperial projects, the inclusive and the exclusive, were very bad for indigenous populations. There's no way in which indigenous groups profited from Europe's arrival. We can say that indeed it was a great defeat in 1521 for indigenous peoples, though we're used to calling it the conquest of Mexico. It's a question of point of view. Nonetheless, what we see is very different results from these ideas. So you see here, if ideas drive events or events drive ideas, social historians will ask that chicken and egg question endlessly. Here, I want to say that I think the colonization of America, we might give, the spectrum, the balance might shift a bit toward the side of ideas. America was an idea in the mind of Europe before it was ever looked at as a real place. And you can see that the English colonizers arrived with a very different idea, and the product is very different. The same with Spain. The idea that all must be somehow included is an important cause for the heterogeneity of Mexican society that we can see to this day. So the word that Paz uses, and I think it might be worth trying to find in my text, it's on page 367, if I'm not mistaken. We'll jump now a bit ahead. Let's see, 360. On 367, what we have is a discussion actually of gender, and I want to save that for a minute. Let's talk about the word syncretism. And that word is used throughout the essay. And here what I've described and what Paz describes in Mexico is a policy of colonization that results in a syncretic culture, a culture that is a mixture of various cultures, obviously indigenous and Indian, but it's a land that he says of superimposed pasts. And so I think if we can keep clearly in mind the notion of inclusive and exclusive with the result of a syncretic culture in the case of Mexico, much more than in the case of the US, where finally we have have had for most of our history a privileging of a melting pot, but that melting pot doesn't lead to heterogeneity, it leads to homogenization. One melts out the differences. So there's a very different respect and regard for difference in the two imperial projects. You'll remember in the essay, and if you haven't read it yet, please do so. There's a point after this discussion of inclusive and exclusive structures that Paz looks with some care at the role of festivals, the role of the body in such cultures, in the different cultures, the role of death, how death is regarded very differently in the two cultures, and Mexico and the US, of course, and one might want to extrapolate from the discussion of Mexico to much of Latin America. He speaks of the refusal of modernity on the part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. I think that's an issue that can be argued from a number of perspectives. I take it, in fact, that the lecture that preceded me by Tom O'Brien had something to do with that, and maybe we can come around to that later. But it's page 366 and 367, and this may also resonate with the lecture that just occurred, the discussion of capitalism that Paz goes into. I think if we had to say which a centrist or a pluralist culture would lend itself most likely and most willingly to capitalism, we might think that the pluralist culture, the North American exclusive, individual-centered culture, might tend to lend itself to capitalism. That's what Paz concludes here. look at what he says. We might read it a bit together. This is the bottom of 366. Capitalism exalts the activities and behavior patterns traditionally called virile. Aggressiveness, the spirit of competition and emulation, combativeness. American society, and here by American he means U.S., American society made these values its own, the virile, the masculine values of capitalism. This perhaps explains why nothing like the Mexicans' devotion to the Virgin of Guadalupe appears in the different versions of Christianity professed by Americans, including the Catholic minority. The Virgin unites the religious sensibility of the Mediterranean and Mesoamerica, both of them regions that fostered ancient cults of feminine deities. Guadalupe Tonantzin is the mother of all Mexicans. Let me interrupt Paz for a moment to say, I will show you an image of Guadalupe, the Virgin of Guadalupe, which many of you certainly would recognize instantly, but Guadalupe is a great example of cultural syncretism. The reference to Tonantzin is the mother goddess of the Aztec culture, the very place where Guadalupe appeared to the Indian child Juan Diego in 1531, as history recounts. That is, she is a goddess and also a virgin. She combines, she is a syncretic virgin. She combines the cultures in a very symbolic way, and her power in contemporary Mexico seems to me to attest to that, the power of that combination. So we'll look at an image of the Virgin in a moment. But to continue on with the text, I think this is an area for speculation, and I'd like you to speculate, and perhaps we'll have a chance to later too, about what it means that a culture is virile and another is feminine. This is what Paz is proposing to us, that the capitalist culture of the U.S. tends toward the virile virtues, whereas now the Virgin encodes something very different. So the Guadalupe Tonantzin is the mother of all Mexicans, Indians, mestizos, whites, but she's also a warrior virgin whose image has often appeared on the banners of peasant uprisings. In the Virgin of Guadalupe, we encounter a very ancient vision of femininity, which, as was true of the pagan goddesses, is not without a heroic tint. He continues, and I ask you to continue as well reading. We don't need to read the entire essay together, but you'll remember here that he goes on to argue that the rights of women are more advanced, according to him, in the U.S. That seems to me to be the case when compared to Mexico. But women's rights have been advanced not because of a respect for the feminine so much as a respect for the equality of all people. That seems to me to be fine, but he's making a differentiation between the valorization of the feminine and females. He also recognizes the oppression that may result in. So I think Paz, as usual, is making a complicated argument, but to raise the positioning of gender as we look culturally at Mexico and the U.S. is a very valid question to raise, and it seems to me very interesting that he should immediately cite the Virgin of Guadalupe as part of that comparative cultural consideration. There are other parts as well. He continues, you'll remember, and here finally, perhaps we should hurry somewhat through the rest of the essay, but he talks about modernity, progress, the importance of progress to the U.S. cultural context, the more conservative bent, the more communal bent of Mexico, and all of these things seem to me to be very suggestive. Let's turn to the end of the essay, and I will say that this essay was written in 1979. It's not a recent essay, though it has been included now in his Paz's very famous essay, collection of essays, The Labyrinth of Solitude. So you can find it under the title, The Labyrinth of Solitude. Let's go ahead and look at what is a kind of call to action at the end of this essay, and I think it's as valid now as it was in 1979, though some of his references have changed. Let's look at page 374, if you will. He lists at the top of the page, and I've outlined text that seems to me to be important, the ideological wars of the 20th century. He mentions a number of crises of Western culture. Remember, his subject finally is Western civilization, as he began by telling us. But here he comes to what is a very strong statement, the sickness of the West. And now he's not talking about the US and he's not talking about Mexico. He's talking about a crisis of Western civilization. And he talks about it in the terms that I think are, again, worth looking at. This is past the moralist, but I think past the moralist is very useful for us to listen to at this point. He says, the sickness of the West is moral rather than social and economic. It is true that the economic problems are serious and that they have not been solved. Inflation and unemployment are on the rise. Poverty has not disappeared despite affluence. Several groups, women and racial, religious, and linguistic minorities, still are or feel excluded. But the real, most profound discord lies in the soul. The future has become the realm of horror, and the present has turned into a desert. Well, we can say he overstates the case. What is he talking about? But let's for a moment listen to him. The liberal societies spin tirelessly, not forward, but round and round. What he's saying is that for all our affluence, we don't easily find meaning. But by we there, he has co-opted us all. That is, he's willing to say this is a shared characteristic of Western culture. Now, the liberal societies spin tirelessly, not forward, but round and round. If they change, they're not transfigured. The hedonism of the West is the other face of desperation. Its skepticism is not wisdom, but renunciation. Its nihilism ends in suicide and in inferior forms of credulity, such as political fanaticisms and magical chimeras. He continues, and I ask you to continue. This is a kind of Jeremiah, if you want, at the end, and we wonder where he's headed, but he's headed to someplace very specific, and I think it's important for U.S. residents to pay particular attention. If you will turn to the very last page, 376, I think we'll find his conclusion here. This is his final salvo, if you want, and I hope it might be resonant with what we've been talking about. I think that every time a society finds itself in crisis, it instinctively turns its eyes towards its origin and looks there for a sign. Colonial American society, that's U.S. society, was a free, egalitarian, but exclusive society. Faithful to its origins, in its domestic and foreign policies alike, the United States has always ignored the others. Remember what I said about the Puritans and what he said. There's no real need to take otherness into account. As ideas entered, as the Reformation ideas entered, and unfortunately, Paz is about to say that continues to be the case. We may wish to say, but we've gotten better, and in fact, I think we have, but let's keep on going. Today, the United States faces very powerful enemies, but the mortal danger comes from within, not from Moscow. Of course, this was written during the Cold War. Not from Moscow, but from the mixture of arrogance and opportunism, blindness and short-term Machiavellianism, volubility and stubbornness, which has characterized its foreign policies during recent years, and which reminds us in an odd way of the Athenian state in its quarrel with Sparta. To conquer, here we'll finish this. To conquer its enemies, the United States must first conquer itself, return to its origins, not to repeat them, but to rectify them. The others, the minority inside, as well as the marginal countries and nations outside, do exist. Not only do we others, you see he's now identifying quite correctly Octavio Paz with the others. Not only do we others make up the majority of the human race, but also each marginal society, poor though it may be, represents a unique and precious version of mankind. If the United States is to recover fortitude and lucidity, it must recover itself, and to recover itself, it must recover the others, the outcasts of the Western world. Well, we may want to think that Octavio Paz is being very hard on residents of the US, that in fact we have now perhaps a national and cultural interest in otherness, in, let's say, ethnic and racial minorities, in women. There's an attempt to be more comprehensive, perhaps. But I think it's useful to see the stars under which the US and Mexico were colonized, that is, those ideas that impelled the colonization of these two areas, and to think what that results in. And to be careful, because one must return to one's origins, Paz says, and think about rectifying them. Now, so I think Paz has a great deal to tell us, and I hope you will find so too. What I'd like to do now is go to some examples of visual art that were the vehicles by which these two ideologies entered. The New World entered America. I'm really going to focus primarily on Baroque art, the use of the Baroque as a tool for the centrist culture of Spanish Catholicism in Mexico. I'm going to ask you to imagine the churches 100 years later and more in Massachusetts Bay, in Plymouth, the simple, undecorated walls, the cross without the body of Christ. That is the real refusal of imagery, of physical and bodily display on the part of the Protestant Reformation. And I want to look at its opposite and show you some pictures and suggest that the Baroque was a real instrument for the centralizing, inclusive ideology that we've just talked about. So let me start by showing you some images, and I'll have to play with the TV if you'll excuse me for doing so. I want to show you some pictures of the Baroque architecture that was imported into New Spain, into Mexico. What you will see again and again is an amazing filling of space. As you know, the Baroque is very interested in filling the vacuum. There's a phrase that's the horror of the vacuum, that the Baroque artist and Baroque art have a horror of the vacuum. What you may think of, now what I hope you will be thinking of, is the consonance between what you're looking at and what we've just talked about, the Reformation Catholic urge to include. This is obviously an inclusive art, one where there is nothing that isn't represented. And my argument will ultimately be, and it's not only mine but a number of contemporary critics, that the Baroque gave space for the indigenous to hide, that there was a way in which the idols were behind the altars, and that the Baroque was itself, and is itself still, a syncretic mode and a syncretic form of expression. Now, I'll just show you one more. This is at Tepeyac, one of the buildings at the site, now of course the great shrine of Basilica of Guadalupe, the site of her apparition in 1531 to Juan Diego, the little Indian boy. Again, the beauty of the work, I say beauty, it happens to be that I like the Baroque. I hope you also do. There are some people who find it de trop, they find it too much, they find it démesuré, out of proportion. My own feeling is that the Mexican Baroque reached a kind of apogee which is admirable and beautiful. So therefore showing you these pictures. Here we see the Virgin, carved the Virgin of Guadalupe standing on her half moon, which I'll show you more closely in a moment. These are pages, again, it's not so easy to see, but the altars that are inside of the great Baroque churches. This one happens to be at Tepoztlan outside of Mexico City, now the Vice-Regal Museum of Mexico. But what you see here, and you'll remember Octavio Paz's comments about festivals, the need to spend, the need to enjoy, and somehow the need for release in the Mexican Catholic culture is here personified. Think again of the bare walls in Massachusetts. I'm going to talk to you, if I have time, about why it was that the visual image became a mode to find the invisible, how the visible is a conduit to spirit in the Baroque Catholic ideology, whereas quite the contrary among the Puritans. Visual images, indeed worldly things altogether, are an obstacle rather than a vehicle to see God. So here, this kind of wealth of ornament, and here I'll just have the page move over a teeny bit if I can. The details are incredibly realistic. Here, it's the same altar, but closer. And you can see that the statues are utterly lifelike. It's flesh and blood. There's a real sense that it's important that the things of this world signify the things of the next. It's not the otherworldly sense that we have in the Puritans, where it's a vertical relation between the self and God. No, here one can look out and see the world and nonetheless be conducted to a spiritual realm. So one more example of this. This book happens to have many. But if we've said that the physical self, flesh and blood, is a way to a conduit to spirit, then there's no more important moment in Christ's life for Spanish Catholicism than that moment when man and God meet, and that is on the cross. So there's a great emphasis in Mexico, as you may well know, on Christ's passion, meaning Christ's death on the cross, because it's at this moment that he's both man and God. It's this moment that conjoins these two worlds. And there, again, are very realistic descriptions. Ones that make, I was raised in the Protestant tradition in this country, it makes me at times turn my head because the blood, the human hair that's often on the statues is so lifelike that it's not part of the tradition that I'm used to. But this, again, the Spanish Baroque is a highly naturalistic tradition as well as incredibly ornamented. I find here these arabesques behind this the notion of nature as a conduit to to heaven, very different from the Protestant ideas, as I've said. So my point here, and I'll continue to make it by showing you a few more images, is that there's a certain visual syncretism that comes into play along with the cultural syncretism that we've been talking about. Here, physical beauty is desirable because it is a conduit to metaphysical truth, and it can include all sorts of things. Here, let me show you now some indigenous works of art. We call them art now. They were vehicles for worship. And you will see again a Baroque spirit. Of course, to impose a European category, this is Guadalupe, whom you may recognize. Let's see. You can see her. She's in the. She's a great goddess, an Aztec goddess, sculpted out of a single piece of stone, probably just shortly before the Spanish conquest of Mexico. So, figure 1400s. She has many symbolic details. Her head, actually, in the myth, has been cut off, and out of her neck spring two serpents. So you see that there are two serpents' faces facing each other, which appear to be a head but are really her neck. Guadalupe means skirt of serpents, and so she has serpents on her skirt here, hands and hearts on a necklace, referring to the practice of human sacrifice, feet that are not human. So a combination of all kinds of animals, including woman. Again, a kind of inclusive, an accumulative structure that we may think of as Baroque. And in fact, it's here that the term New World Baroque may be useful. And the New World Baroque is a very ideological and political term. And it was coined most notably and probably generatively by a Cuban writer called Alejo Carpentier. And he speaks very much and very often about, and if we're a literature class, we would be reading some of his novels where he dramatizes this New World Baroque, which is inclusive, overlapping, syncretic. And what's included? Well, Here we have Guadalupe, who is included in a sense, and inclusive in the sense that she herself embodies a combination. She's anything but pure in the sense of the Puritans who wanted to separate out and singularize. Carpentier also talks about Xochicalco, which is a site outside of Cuernavaca. I show you again these New World Baroque forms. Here, this is Xochicalco, one of the carved figures on the facade. And here, the temple of Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent. And you can see here, if you could, or maybe you can, the plumed serpent who slithers along the facade with all kinds of ornament, no empty space left to be filled. It's all filled by ornament. Again, a kind of New World Baroque. Here the point is that Carpentier does not allow the notion of Baroque to remain in Europe and to remain in the 17th century, which was the high Baroque period, as you know, in Europe. He says, the Baroque was in the New World long before the Baroque was imported by the Spaniards to the New World. But when it was, then we have the Baroque to the second degree. We have the New World Baroque. Another example that Carpentier gives in a famous essay discussing this is this facade at, at Teotihuacan, the pyramids outside of Mexico City. And you can see here, remember the retablo, the altars I was showing you a moment ago with all of the statues clinging to this kind of space. Here we might think of that same structure, a highly decorative, inclusive, decentralized, circulating structure. Because what the Baroque does not have, like classical architecture, is a single perspective. There's a kind of circulation and dilation in space which allows for a kind of cultural movement as well as a aesthetic movement. Let me show you now another area of Latin American and especially Mesoamerican art. Again, the word art is a Western imposition. These are the Codices, which were the pre-Hispanic books. They are painted. It's an ideographic and pictographic rather than alphabetic language, as you can see. This is the Borgia Codex, which are fragments of this kind of writing, which is on amate paper from the bark of the amate tree, or sometimes on skin, but always very elaborately designed. Again, Carpentier would have it Baroque, the New World Baroque. So we have various figures. This book on this side explains what these figures are. It's been this text has been very carefully scrutinized. This interpretation was published in 1904. So the Borgia has been studied a great deal and for quite a long time. I show you another page. This figure is one of my favorites. He represents the fifth world direction. There's north, east, south, and west. And then there's the direction of up and down, or the center. And this is the figure of the direction, the fifth world direction of up and down in the Nahua culture. So again, if you want, let me encourage you, and one more time say that this is a certain sort of Baroque structure, which now we're going to see integrated into the Baroque of the colonies. One more example, and this is one where really there is this integration of the indigenous forms with the Spanish Baroque forms that were brought on the ships from Spain. This is a fabulous small church outside of the city of Puebla called Tonancintla. This is what it looks like on the outside. It's very much a small folk church. These are inlaid pieces of ceramic on the facade and colorfully painted. As you can see, if I can ask you your visual memory to work back to the very first image I showed you, that kind of amazing facade of Tepoztlan, you can see how this is folk Baroque. It has a certain sort of energy of the same sort, but much much less opulent, much less carved, much less sculpted. Nonetheless, there are figures here on the facade that are statues, and I'll show you just a couple of the pages from the inside. Here's the dome of the church. As you can see, it's incredibly recargado is the word in Spanish. It's incredibly burdened, encumbered by figures, human figures, by arabesques, and all with a kind of white, and much of it embossed. So if you ran your hand over the walls, it's very bumpy. This, of course, is the dome, but you can see the figures here that I'm going to show you in a closer version. Look at these. They're like little dolls. There's a kind of naive, almost what we might call naive art, but very much, again, the Baroque impulse to fill space, to resist a central axis. There's not a single way in which your eye is asked to move. There's not a vanishing point as there is in Renaissance perspective. So again, a kind of metaphor for the syncretism that was taking place in the Hispanic New World. Here are a few more views. You'll see this is the very top. We saw the dome. This is the light hanging down, but this figure at the top, almost clown-like, but of course an angel. Of course, at the very top of the dome, someone who would look down favorably upon the worshipers in the church. Here, a figure of God the Father with his heavenly hosts, and on. One more page, and then I will show you just one last example. But here we have the saints, as you can see. Here's St. Christopher, recognizable by the child he carries, and so forth. But obviously a very different feel from the retablos that I showed you at the outset, those beautifully elongated, realistic figures. This is a kind of folk Baroque, but nonetheless a form that is flexible for the church, and I suppose for the people who worship there. Otherwise it wouldn't have been built. I recommend that you go there, Tonancintla, a very interesting syncretic work and place. Now, one more image, and that's the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and with that I will stop, and we can have a conversation. This is a very high art version of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Ordinarily, her robes are blue. This happens to be one that has inlaid mother of pearl and is very elaborate. But the Virgin of Guadalupe, as you know, is always seen exactly in this form. The crescent moon is under her feet. The child holds up the crescent moon, the child angel. You see his wings. And she has her hands are tied with a kind of ribbon that is an Aztec, or was an Aztec, symbol of fertility. So, of course, this is the Purísima. This is the Virgin before she has had the Christ child. But we have integrated into that image indigenous elements, and of course then also the story that she appears to the Indian child Juan Diego. You know the story, I imagine, but I'll remind you of the details. She appears to the Indian child and gives him a bouquet of roses, which he is told to take to the bishop to say that she has appeared to him in a place where there can't possibly be roses. Tepeyac, the place sacred to Tonantzin, the mother goddess of the Aztec group there. The boy runs to the bishop, and the bishop says, no, this can't be. Juan Diego goes back to the spot where she has appeared, and this time he says, the Virgin says, I will prove my existence, my apparition, by imprinting my image upon your garb. And the image that was imprinted, according to the story, is this image. So when we look at the Virgin of Guadalupe, in whatever form she's painted or carved or sculpted, it is the impress of her image on the garb, the white cotton or white garb of Juan Diego. That piece of cloth is on view in the Basilica of Guadalupe in Mexico City. I make a point of this. We could say, well, that's a nice story, and indeed I think it is a nice story, in part to say how important the visual image was within the Baroque culture. And when we go to Mexico and we see the ways in which the Virgin of Guadalupe's image is everywhere at taxi stands, restaurants, and so forth, and beyond that, the incredibly visual nature of religion and religious instruction as such, we have to know that there's a very different attitude toward the physical world. It's a Thomistic attitude. St. Thomas, basing himself in Aristotle, found in the real world the basis for thought, the basis for thinking. So that's another lecture, and I won't go into the medieval and ancient philosophical roots of the Baroque, but this importance of the visual image, even as a proof of a divine apparition, as you can see, is something that is very Catholic and Counter-Reformation and very little Puritan. But I want to go back to Guadalupe and this story for one moment. There's a very important book that is about the issues of transculturation and syncretism that I've been talking to you about, and that's a book called Quetzalcoatl and Guadalupe by Jacques Lafay, L-A-F-A-Y-E. It's Oxford University Press, if I'm not mistaken. And in that, in his discussion of Guadalupe and this image, the image of Guadalupe, which is as Mexican can be, he says, and here, this in a way to tie it perhaps back to the lecture you've just heard, that it was with the beginning with this image, most certainly painted and repainted eventually by Tlaquilos, indigenous painters. It's in this image that the real Mexican national consciousness emerges. He says, because of course the Virgin of Guadalupe there is a Virgin of Guadalupe in Spain. The place name is from Spain, Guadalupe. It was imported, but as her image began to change, and this is radically different from what was brought from Spain, that it's there that Mexican national consciousness begins to emerge. And so this substitution of the Virgin of Guadalupe of Extremadura, the part of Spain where Guadalupe is, to this Tepeyac version is an important move toward something like Mexico, toward a community and a communal consciousness, even as the superimposition of cultures is operating, and we may wish to lament that superimposition as well. So I think with that, maybe Steve and Quetzil, I'll invite you over, and you can take over for my poor failing voice and think about some of these issues in concert. Y'all want to come over? Okay, good. Good. And in the meantime, let me ask you all if you have questions or things that you can bring to the discussion. Yes, please.
Is there any possibility the Baroque you had said, I didn't know this, but the Baroque you had said was 17th century in Europe?
The Baroque Codex? I'm sorry, the what?
The Baroque style of art.
Baroque. Yeah, when you read art histories of Europe, 17th century, that is the 1600s, are what are considered to be high Baroque. Now, think if one thinks in terms of art historical periods as defined by European art historians, you would think of the Renaissance, the Quattrocento, for example, the 1400s, the great Italian Renaissance. And then between Renaissance and Baroque, there's in some areas Mannerism, where you have elongated figures, think of El Greco and so forth. But then the Baroque is fairly thoroughgoing, and certainly in Spain, but also in other parts of Catholic Europe. Polish Baroque art and architecture is quite impressive. What's interesting is we practically don't use the word Baroque in referring to anything in the Anglo-American tradition. The word Baroque, for example, in literature is practically not used. We certainly have 17th century poets who are wonderful. Think of the Metaphysicals, the Cavaliers, John Donne, Milton, but we don't call them Baroque. So somehow the term Baroque has been very much reserved for 17th century Catholic European art. And it's there that Carpentier says, hey, wait a minute. if the Baroque is a refusal of a central perspective, if it's a movement in space, then look at all of the indigenous art that we can also call Baroque, and that we can talk about in terms of the same sorts of principles.
That's what I wanted to ask. Is there a possibility that the New World art had influenced the Baroque movement in Europe?
Aha, very interesting. Probably not. I mean, the kinds of, certainly a lot of things, objects, and even people were taken back to the old world and looked on as great curiosities. But it's not until the 18th and even 19th century that things get exported as art objects. For example, the codices that we've looked at, which I said are interesting art, of course they were ceremonial objects and tribal objects. That is, they were the myths and legends and records of a given people. Some Europeans went to Mexico and found them rather interesting. They found their ways into the museums and libraries of Europe, but there was no particular attention paid to them. So when I show you a picture of the Borgia Codex, and I say that is Baroque, that's a perfect example of something that was paid very little attention to on any aesthetic level in Europe. So it's a very interesting notion. What I'd say is that the indigenous forms influenced almost immediately the New World Baroque, that you start to see Mexico developing its own kind of Baroque, and you start to see the echoes of certain things that are already there. After all, the first painters and architects were Indians. You know, right away in 1521, Cortés enters Tenochtitlan and conquers it. Basically, he just takes it and claims it his and the kings of Spain. That's 1521. By 1524, 12 Franciscans have arrived to begin the project of conversion. By 1531, the Dominicans and the Augustinians have arrived. There's an amazingly quick imposition in Mexico because it was clear to the Spanish crown how much there was to be gained, not only in the conversion of souls, but in resources to continue the wars that were being fought on all fronts. So I think if you were to ask me if indigenous forms influenced the Baroque in Mexico, I would say yes, instantly. The very hands that were painting indigenous Baroque began painting after European engravings on walls, which you can still visit in Mexico, very early friezes and scenes from the Bible, which look weird. Because, I mean, they have a particular style to them, and those painters are called tlacuilos, and some are even known by name. Records were kept, very good records. But as for the 17th century in Europe, the High Baroque period, I think there the influence hadn't yet started to move from west to east. But interesting question. There may be exceptions to that, but generally not. Other things? Yes.
I just wanted to clarify the terminology in my head.
Yes, please.
I was getting confused between the Puritans and the Catholics, which ones were inclusive and which ones were
yes,
exclusive.
thank you. Well, once you read this exceedingly clear essay or reread it by Paz, it'll be very clear to you. But the Puritans are, of course, Protestants. They're part of the Reformation. Remember that in 1517, Martin Luther said this is enough, and he's Northern European protest against Southern, that is Roman Catholicism. The Puritans are a wildly fringe group of the Reformation, which begins then to occur. The Puritans are a group in England that feel that even the English church, which is now Protestant, should be purified. So they are called almost derisively by the Church of England. They're called Puritans. They're the exclusive ones. When you figure you want purity, what do you want to do? Get rid of stuff, right? If you want pure milk, then you homogenize it and you get rid of the germs. The Puritans were very interested in their own vision. I'm not saying that it's better or worse, really, but what it leads to is a kind of blindness to other groups, simply because it's not part of your ideology to be interested in those other groups. Whereas if you're in, and I won't, that's certainly not true of all Protestantism. I mean, I don't mean, but those Reformation roots, and think of it in another way. What stake did England have in Massachusetts? None. this little splinter group was just out of their hair for a while. You know, the English didn't go in like I've just described the Spanish and know immediately that this was a marvelous opportunity and one for colonization conversion. The English, it took them really decades and longer to begin to notice that they could tax the colonists, you know. So that's where our revolution comes from, is finally England, well, began exploiting the land, but there was no real attempt to do anything much with the New World as such. The Spanish project was completely different. Spain knew it needed money. It knew that this was a world that it could exploit for money. The English basically sent, those people went who wanted to get out of England because they didn't like England's policies. So it's the Puritans that are exclusive, right? And the Reformation or Counter-Reformation Catholics that are inclusive. They need to make everything fit into a universal system. So does that clear?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, good. Okay, maybe we can connect this up. I didn't get to hear the lecture before, nor in fact the ones that have gone on over the week. So maybe you all can tie some of this together for me. So you want to sit down? Shall we do that? Or should we stand here?
I'm going to say a couple of things, but let's sit down.
Okay, good.
One of the joys of this class is that it lets us see through the eyes of fundamentally different disciplines. We often hear talk of interdisciplinary study, but we rarely get to see what it means in practice. Earlier, we had a, I think, stunning overview of the changes that took place in the economies, social structures, and political structures of Latin America and the United States over a sweeping period of 3 centuries. But those aren't the only changes that take place in human existence, right? All human beings have minds, and we're not just interested in what happens in a kind of measurable sense. We're also interested in its human meaning, and we're interested in the cultural representations that people make of all this. And what we're doing in our class right now is making the shift from histories to cultures. And I think if we're going to really understand ourselves, we need to understand this. Not only is this class interdisciplinary, but it is also truly comparative and hemispheric. We're always told that we should get some perspective on ourselves. My parents still tell me this as I get older and older, and it seems more hopeless. But the way you get perspective on yourself is not simply by looking within. I've done that long enough. It hasn't gotten me very far. It's looking outside and seeing how other people who are a lot like you but are different in some really fundamental ways, how they're different. And then suddenly it reveals things about yourself that you never knew before. This difference that we've been hearing about a more Catholic outlook, a more Baroque outlook, and a more stark Protestant outlook is truly fundamental. We can't understand much about this society, United States society today, without knowing about this. And yet we act most of the time without this perspective. We tend to be very narrow and provincial. We saw in a lecture, I believe last week, that there weren't any art museums in the United States until the 1870s. You couldn't have gone and seen visual representations of art in most cities because there weren't art museums to easily get to. There was, of course, some artists, but most of them actually lived in England because they couldn't support themselves in the United States. I mean, this is a striking example, I think, of how these cultures are truly different. Before I yield the floor, I want to show you some statistics, which I'm afraid are not in a neat, easily understandable style. If we could have the overhead projector, please. Okay. Now, what do these statistics mean? In 1650, 6% of the population in Spanish America was white, and 9% of the population of Spanish America was black, and 84% was Indian. Okay. If you look at what's now the United States and Canada, the statistics are not much different in 1650. That is, 12% of the population's white, 2% is black, and 85% is Indian. But let's just jump ahead to 1825, not that long into the future, 175 years, and look at how different the picture is. In Spanish America, 18% of the population is white, 22% is black, and nearly 60% is Indian. In the United States and Canada, now 80% of the population's white, 17% black, and less than 4% is Indian. I mean, what a dramatic difference has taken place in a relatively brief period of time. And think what it means for cultures and for people's outlooks. The syncretism that Professor Zamora has been talking about is so hard to maintain if you eliminate one of the groups that's contributing to that syncretism. Okay, let's sit down and discuss.
Well, I want to start with a thank you for the wonderful lecture.
Oh, you're welcome.
Put some things in perspective.
Thank goodness my voice didn't go completely. I was worried.
The question that I'd like to start with, I think we've touched upon in this class at various points the issue of the Virgin of Guadalupe from several different perspectives. Steve has discussed it, and I think some other people have discussed it as well. And again, we have some beautiful representations of this. In the last class, I asked the question in general, in a rhetorical way, about sharing. What is it to share? And so since you've raised the issue of the Virgin of Guadalupe as a symbol that consolidated, as a symbol of inclusion that was used, that allowed for the society to be brought together in an inclusionary sense to create community, and then that this, in the end of your discussion there, to raise the issue of how this Virgin became central as a cultural icon and figure, symbol, for consolidating a national identity. And so I wanted to ask you, pose to you a question, not trick,
Okay.
but it might seem that way.
Well, that's good.
What about the nature of sharing? What is it to share this symbol of the Virgin of Guadalupe amongst Mexicans? Is there, you've talked about in different styles, the Protestant style of exclusionary and the Catholic style of inclusionary. So I wanted to get your take on your feeling of what it means to share the symbol,
Right.
especially in the context of a national entity.
Right. First, I think I should one more time say that an exclusive model, I think is I don't mean a value judgment by
Right.
speaking of exclusive and inclusive. So that in a Protestant culture, we may well have symbols and rites and rituals that are as community creating as let's say, the Virgin of Guadalupe. What we won't have in a North American context is the kind of syncretic,
Right.
let's say, power that is the Virgin of Guadalupe. So I guess I would have to ask you a bit more about sharing. If by sharing you mean that there's a certain communal language that gets spoken without sometimes being spoken at all, then again, I'm an outsider looking in as I go to Mexico, but it does seem to me that the power of that image and many others, the power of visual imagery and the ways in which visual images speak in Mexico does seem to me to be a community creating aspect that perhaps we don't have here. And yet we could say, well, what we have in the US and more in Mexico is television, after all, and the movies. I mean, we're a culture that's very given over to the visual, and indeed the visual which creates communal myths for us. I mean, the reissuing of Star Wars is a very interesting example of, I mean, my favorite example of myth is stories that communities tell to themselves about themselves. Now, what are the stories that we tell to ourselves that are meaningful to us and give us something like a shared identity? And I mean, I do think that the Virgin of Guadalupe is probably right up there with the most powerful visual image, because so absolutely, there's an absolute consensus about her worth. It may, and her value and her power and her. And I mean, I have feminist friends who criticize that and say, well, Mexico's too given over to a woman who is impossible to emulate. She is a virgin and a mother. That's not something the rest of us can do. And so we're given an ideal of feminine principle that makes us always the worst by comparison. It seems to me that's a North American feminist perspective. I don't find Mexican women, whether they believe or are believers or not, I don't find them arguing for alienation of that sort. So, as a comparatist, I cast about for the analog in North American culture to the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico. And I guess I do think of the popular media. I think of films, I think of TV, which are, on some level, community-creating myths. On the other, maybe less so. I mean, technological media, it's hard to assess in comparison to a religious icon such as the Virgin. It's an interesting question and hard.
It's a big question.
Yeah. I mean, the Statue of Liberty, let's think, again, we can think of female figures that somehow mean something to us as to North American culture as a collective, but I think the Virgin of Guadalupe wins hands down over the Statue of Liberty. So,
well, it's quite interesting because in the United States, the cultural symbols that one can refer to are commercialized.
well, yes.
And
yes.
in Mexico, in ways that there are really, I think, no counterparts in the United States. They're never folk creations. That is, they're not rooted in a past that is separate from commerce at some stage.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, the real cultural materialist would say, but all of those images of the Virgin of Guadalupe are selling something, and what they're selling is the Catholic Church, and that's an expensive proposition. I mean, there is a way to talk about. I happen to think it's a very different sort of thing, and so I agree with you. I just wanted to play devil's advocate for a moment.
Though it's also sold other things, like the Mexican War struggle for independence. At various points, it's been expropriated, or appropriated rather, for various
yes. In fact, Paz makes that point that she's the warrior goddess. One thinks of Joan of Arc in that sentence that we read together from Paz, that the goddess not without a heroic tint, he says. And she certainly, the Virgin of Guadalupe certainly has a heroic tint in that she's been appropriated for wars. Absolutely. Yeah.
Not long ago, Lois gave a wonderful talk on the way modern artists in Mexico make use of the earlier traditions.
Yeah.
And I wonder if I could ask you to speak just a bit about that, because that's also something that you can't see happen in the United States. We do not have, in the same way, a kind of pre-culture that is easily drawn upon and then be reshaped.
Right. Well, here I would start by saying that the different versions of culture that Paz talks about are different attitudes, contain very different attitudes toward the past. So when you have an artist like Diego Rivera, the great muralist, Mexican muralist, painting into his murals in the 20s and 30s and 40s in Mexico representations that come from the pre-Hispanic codices, then you know that this is a cultural ideology. He's wanting to say, I'm part of a tradition that goes back before Europe. Mexico is something that cannot be contained only by the colonization of Europe. It also is saying something about his notion of originality as an artist. It doesn't bother him to copy things from previous texts. Why? Because he sees himself as part of a tradition. He wants to be traditional rather than original. Whereas North American artists have long since had, I think, a very different view of tradition. Not only do we not have or have erased indigenous art by and large, but there's been a sense that you couldn't go back. Why would you want to go back? No, make it new. You know, the great cry of the avant-garde, make it new. So to go back and look at previous works of art and include them is something that's less common in U.S. art. It does exist, and more it exists. There's a real, what I call, anxiety of origins in U.S. writers. For example, think of all the writers from Henry James to T.S. Eliot, the lost generation in Paris have all gone to Europe. Why? Because they felt that they needed to go to Europe to find some past that America, the New World, didn't offer. So even U.S. artists and writers who don't want to announce themselves as part of a tradition by copying or repeating previous forms of expression are nonetheless troubled by where they fit. It's an American state of mind, I think, with a ruptured tradition from Europe, a ruptured tradition with indigenous cultures. Who are we? And again, Paz gets that just right. Remember, toward the end of that essay, we looked at it. He says it's a great theme that Americans look for origins. Why? Because they're not easily available. If we knew what they were, we wouldn't be looking for them. But that's foregrounded in Mexican art in ways that it's not in U.S. art, where we yelled, make it new for a lot of decades anyway.
Well, we thank you immensely.
Oh, good. Well, it was very
for taking
interesting.
This time with us.
Yes, very interesting. I think your students are going to have a great deal to put together, to stitch together. You know, rhapsody is based on the notion of stitching and weaving. So this is a great rhapsody you're creating here.
Well, we're making a wonderful move, I hope, for you. That is, we're moving from the world of material institutions, power structures, and the like, into the world of people's minds, into ideas, perceptions, artistic and religious forms of expression. Thank you again.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.